that they intended for the well to enter into that kind of limbo status where that some wells have had for decades now.
And Jeff, your report also indicates that the federal government has been warned for the better part of 2 decades now. There was a GAO report back in 1989 warning of potential problems and possibly even disasters from these plugged wells.
Yeah, that's right. I think that report was in 1994, and the GAO, that's of course Congress's investigative arm, warned that these abandoned wells could pose a serious environmental problem. It even used the phrase environmental disaster. And it said the federal government ought to come up with some reasonable program of inspecting these kinds of wells. It never happened. We found records of the EPA saying that on land, these kinds of wells pose a significant threat to the environment, even when they've been fully depleted, because people should understand that even when a well was used for production and it no longer is producing anything in paying quantities, it can become re-energized, repressurized again, sometimes from the aquifers that are underneath that push upward, sometimes from work on other wells nearby. So these wells always have the potential to produce pressure again, and the danger, of course, is that the gas or the oil underneath the seafloor then can push up through spaces in the well and escape into the ocean. Of course, the oil and gas are toxic. They're not supposed to be in the ocean, and they can affect the aquatic species in the oceans.
And what kind of personnel did MMS, the agency in charge of this, have devoted to monitoring these wells?
So ask your question again. I'm not sure I got the sense of it. I apologize.
What kind of personnel did MMS, the agency that was supposedly in charge of, of offshore drilling, have to monitor these plugged wells?
Well, MMS, they're the new Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Enforcement, Regulation and Enforcement. That's their new name, where their safety functions have been peeled off to this new agency. They have really very limited personnel. They have some scores of people who are available for inspections in the Gulf, but remember, we're talking about thousands and thousands of active wells, either in some stage of drilling, typically, in the Gulf. So they really, common sense tells you that they have serious constraints on what they can look at, and they've chosen to focus on the wells that are active. It's not clear that they have the resources even to look at the abandoned wells, and I think that was part of what Senator Udall was getting at in his letter to Ken Salazar. Udall is a member of the Energy Committee. Salazar is a fellow Coloradan, like Senator Udall. And I think that's part of what Udall was getting at when he said, do you need some kinds of additional tools to keep these abandoned wells safe?
This has provoked outrage among many leading environmental groups, calling on some kind of regulation. Melanie Duchesneau, quote, a spokeswoman for Greenpeace, said she was shell-shocked by the AP report, upset the government isn't doing a thing to make sure they weren't leaking. Jeff Dahn, what do you think has to be done first right now? I mean, this is quite remarkable to talk about tens of thousands of abandoned wells in the Gulf of Mexico.
Well, I think part of what happened is this was a significant problem that was way off everybody's radar. The industry and the government just acted like it was a problem that didn't exist. These wells are gone and forgotten. A federal petroleum engineer told me they're not supposed to leak. So it was something that people weren't paying attention to. Even people in the industry were surprised to realize that there were so many abandoned wells out there. I think what Udall is driving at and what people will begin to think about is whether there might be some value for starters, at least as a first step, to consider maybe whether there should be inspections of at least some of these well sealing jobs as the companies get ready to abandon them. We know that it can be done in a practical way. California, for example, does it, and they make a special effort to inspect the wells that are being abandoned offshore, because they know that if anybody has to come back to an offshore well, it's going to be harder and more expensive. Some of these offshore jobs in the deep wells, they can be thousands of feet deep. Some of them can cost millions of dollars just to abandon the well. And part of the problem is that can't be a profit center for the companies.
Jeff, one final question. I'm shocked by the number here that you have 50,000 wells over 6 years have been drilled in the Gulf. You're talking about 8,000 a year. That's about 25 wells per day for the last 60 years have been drilled in the Gulf of Mexico.
That's right. It started off, of course, a little bit more slowly, and the curve kind of went upward. But there's been a tremendous amount of drilling. It started in the 1940s, and it's increased ever since. There has been more water and more drilling in deeper water, 1,000 feet deep, that kind of depth, even deeper than that in recent years, and that's picking up. And part of the problem with that in this context is that it's just harder to get at the wells, to abandon them when they're that deep. It can be done. It just takes a little bit more time and money to make sure that it's done right. So that's part of the concern as well, that some of these more recent wells that are now being abandoned are going to take more effort to seal properly.
Jeff Dahn, we want to thank you for being with us, national writer for AP, member of AP's National Investigative Unit that has reported this piece, Gulf Awash and 27,000 Abandoned Wells. We'll link to it at democracynow.org. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.